All right, welcome back to Frem and Final, everybody. And for today's topic, it's the state of gene therapy. And I have with me today three wonderful guests. We have Ashley Hume, who's the president of Emerging Therapy Solutions. We have Kelly Munger, who is the head of U.S. Health at PartnerRe. And we have Brooks Wildasin, who is the chief product and innovation officer at Havarti Risk. And for my very first question, I want to ask you guys, why are you so into gene therapy? What do you guys do today that has you connected to gene therapy? Kelly, why don't we start with you?
Sure. PartnerRe is a big reinsurer and stop-loss carrier, right? So we wake up every day thinking about large, complicated claims, and gene cell therapies, they fall right into that bucket. So that's definitely why we're interested in it, and our clients are very interested in it.
Yeah, Ashley, how about you?
Well, at ETS, it is a huge part of our focus. So we work on catastrophic claims for things like transplant, but cell and gene therapy has really been our focus over the course of the last 6 years since we started the company. And personally, I just think it's wildly cool science. And I think, it's pretty incredible that as a market, we are moving from treating disease to, in theory, curing it. So it's just really cool science.
And Brooks, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Mabe. So here at Havarti Risk, we are primarily an actuarial consulting firm. And with these types of therapies, it's a large actuarial consideration across different types of payer clients. So, health plans down to self-funded employers, Medicaid and Medicare as well. So I'd say I have both a personal and kind of professional interest in the science, having been in the cell and gene therapy space kind of since the inception, working alongside pharmaceutical manufacturers. And so got to really experience the market from that side of things before delving deeper into the impact on the payer community at large. And as I think about cell and gene therapy overall, the impact to our healthcare ecosystem is just so massive and going to continue to evolve. And so I like to stay as close to the topic as possible and evolutions. Yeah. And it's something that I can sit and read about for hours and not even think about it as a job.
Sit around and read about it, think about it for hours. Now, the reality is the four of us have known each other for like years, and we've been in that gene therapy and cell therapy circles for many, many years. So I'm going to take you guys back to 2019. And at that time, there were two gene therapies in the market. It was Luxturna and Zolgensma. And the big fear was that Roctavian was going to be coming out in 2020. That had all the insurers and reinsurers kind of going crazy. It was supposed to come out August of 2020 at the low price point of $4.5 million. And then it was delayed. And then COVID happened. And then Roctavian got delayed again. And then finally it came out in June of 23 with a reduced price tag, $2.9 million. But since that time, we just haven't seen the level of utilization that we thought. How did we get this wrong about Roctavian?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to say it was originally Valrox, remember?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, yep. I don't know that I've ever heard the marketing story behind that and why they switched to Roctavian, but that's a side note. Well, I can start with where things maybe went sideways. I think, it's interesting because people put so much focus and emphasis on hemophilia, and so much else is happening in gene therapy. But you're right, it was the first, big, scary gene therapy for the market because it had, a huge prevalence, and people were afraid that every single hemophiliac was going to jump in line and get this therapy the minute that it hit the market. And what we learned was that the target market for, hemophilia gene therapy was a college-age guy, and the lifestyle expectations and impact for that college-age guy did not outweigh the value that they might have received from receiving the gene therapy. And, there
so
was
go into more detail, because it comes down to booze, right?
Yeah, they can't drink alcohol. And I mean, they can't have unprotected sex. Like, these are big lifestyle decisions for a 20-something-year-old guy, because the work happens in their liver, and that's, those are risks that they have to be cognizant of. And there's a ton of follow-up and other things that they have to do if they receive the therapy. And, they're not in contact sports anymore, so they're not, at much of a risk or as much of a risk for a bleed. And they have really great therapies that have been on the market for a long time that they're used to taking, and it's just not a risk people were willing to take. That, coupled with the fact that, you look at the pipeline, especially then, and there was a whole bunch of therapies in development for hemophilia. And are you going to get the first one, or are you going to wait until there's more on the market and then evaluate?
Yeah, and just to underscore that point that Ashley made, talking about it from the science perspective, especially with AAV-based gene therapies, and this isn't specific to Roctavian, but that pipeline is critical from a patient sentiment perspective. If you are to take one of these therapeutics and the next therapy comes for that disease state and uses the same viral vector, your body will have built up antibodies to the viral vector, and you likely will not even be able to use another therapy as an option. So the lifestyle changes, I completely agree with Ashley, but then also just thinking about what the future could hold and decisions you might want to make down the line, especially if something comes out with a stronger degree of efficacy.
Kelly, what about the reinsurers? Because everybody was worried about this. And when you think about hemophilia, that's the one line item that every stop-loss carrier and reinsurer is lasering and excluding.
Yep.
How were reinsurers thinking about that particular therapy back in 2019?
Yeah, I think it was really scary, and you hit it on the head with this. These are claims that we're already lasering and, worried about and seeing big claims and paying big claims on. So hemophiliacs. So, it was something that was a big concern. And I think going into this, there was so much that we didn't know, right? We had to make assumptions. We were making guesses. And, that's what insurance and reinsurance pricing and underwriting is about, right? We take what we know. We try to make some guesses. We make some assumptions and things. And, we got a lot of things wrong because I think we all assumed we'd see more of these claims than we did. And, even now, I don't think we've paid a hemophilia gene therapy claim. So the frequency hasn't been there and the take-up rate hasn't been there. So, but at the time, for us, our margin, a few of these claims eat up our margin really quickly, right? So
That's right.
So we're concerned about it, and things like supply chain issues and these hospital logistics and all of that. I mean, we didn't think about that. So I just think there were a lot of unknowns.
I think it's good to acknowledge that we got it wrong. I think the entire actuarial community amongst like stop loss and reinsurance, they all basically got it wrong. I think we all erred on the side of conservatism. Exactly what you said, Kelly. It just takes one of those claims to wipe away the margin that's already compressed in this environment. And so you just couldn't take that chance. And so that meant a lot of lasering, that meant a lot of increase in reinsurance expenses. But all the other things you said also had a lot to do with the slow utilization of that particular therapy. I guess, tell me what you guys think about COVID and how did that impact the approval timing and process for gene therapies?
I think it was a huge distraction all the way across the board. So for patients, right? For the trials, for the hospitals, for reinsurers and stop-loss carriers, we were focused on COVID and what was happening. So I just think it was a really big distraction, which, go ahead, Brooks, you're probably going to talk about some of the other impacts on the manufacturing side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest impediments was the FDA's ability to get into the manufacturing facilities and validate protocols and quality control and, really all the variables that are outside of just the drug, the treatment itself with regard to manufacturing. And because they couldn't travel, they couldn't get into the facilities, at least for a period of time during COVID, that dramatically delayed their ability to review applications and, assess the safety and efficacy of the therapeutics. So even with accelerated approval mechanisms and things in place, if they can't get in and actually validate the manufacturing processes, then they can't approve therapies. And I mean, frankly, that impacted therapeutic development across the board beyond just cell and gene therapies. But I do think had a disproportionate impact to cell and gene therapies as well.
Well, and I'd take it back even a step further. Like, patients couldn't go to the hospital to participate in clinical trials. And so even the overall pipeline was pushed back. So absolutely true, everything that Brooks just referenced around the FDA and they were also really busy with the vaccines and everything else that was happening at the time. But in general, like, every isolation bed was taken and every resource had been redeployed. Like, the clinical trials themselves suffered significant delays. And so we're just starting to see some of the therapies. We just recently, actually, because we're going through a marketing exercise right now, we just recently looked at some slides from 2019 and 2020 and our pipeline projections from 2019 and 2020. We're still not wrong. Like, a lot of those are right now going through the process of approval because they were delayed and they had to get to whatever numbers they needed to get to be able to submit their BLAs. So I think we're still feeling the effects of COVID.
Okay. But COVID started in roughly March of 2020. I think everybody started coming out of COVID times, let's say summer of 2022. And somewhere between that time and let's say the start of 23, we probably have seen roughly 10 therapies approved post-COVID. And there's now treatments for hemophilia B and sickle cell, beta thalassemia, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. The average costs have actually gone up. The price tags have gone up. What was originally an average price point of $2 to $2.5 million is now $3 to $4 million. But the utilization is still not there of these more recent therapies. What's the difference that we're seeing between the therapies that came to market before COVID and those therapies that came to market after COVID?
I'll jump in again here. Pre-COVID, many of the therapies that were approved were fit more into the cell therapy bucket, specifically with CAR-Ts, which tended to have lower price points out of the gate than the gene therapies. And we've seen that pricing be contained even further in some cases, especially given competition in the markets. I also think that pre-COVID, the therapies that were approved in one case with Luxturna had a very small patient population, and so they had to right size the price tag there. I also think that some of the increased work and research done by organizations like ICER to help to prove the value of the therapeutics using various metrics, quantitative and qualitative, has in some cases impacted the ability to price a little bit higher. Lastly, I think some of the R&D expenses associated with the therapies that were approved post-COVID were much, much higher, just in that they had been under investigation in clinical trials for significant periods of time. I mean, in some cases up to a decade. So when you think about the investment that had to be made, along with some of those other qualitative and quantitative variables that you can read about in some of the ICER publications, that's being reflected in the prices that we're seeing today. And then lastly, layer on minimal competition at least in most of the disease states. It represents the ability to charge a little bit more for these therapeutics.
Absolutely.
We're starting to see, too, post-COVID, more markup on the provider side. So, be it hospital side. So really, that's impacting the cost as well. So not only are the average wholesale price higher, but the actual cost that comes through is much higher, too.
Yeah, you're talking about like the cost of administration. What a hospital, they get the ingredient, which might be the wholesale acquisition cost, $3 or $4 million, but then they're adding another expense to that for them to actually administer and then make a margin on their work.
Right. And sometimes that's quite large, actually.
Yeah. We've seen variability, significant variability to like pass through up to, we had a claim recently come through at $12 million for a $3 million drug.
Wow.
Now, obviously there's going to be discounts and things like that, but if it's PPO contract and it's 80% of charges. I mean, that's
Then
insane.
that's the charge.
Yep.
Yeah. And no stop loss carrier or reinsurer wants to see one of those types of claims. Now, I don't want to belabor this point about low utilization, but here in the news recently, it just feels like gene therapy is taking another blow, right? So in the past couple of months, we've seen Pfizer is exiting both hemophilia A and B. Bluebird Bio, they make, I think, 3 different gene therapies. They're looking for ways to sell their company because the utilization on beta thalassemia and sickle cell just hasn't been there. So what is the future of gene therapy? Is this a thing? Is it going to happen? Or is all that time we spent in those gene therapy circles for the past 8 years going to waste?
I just want to make one comment before we answer your specific question. Just, we started the conversation talking about hemophilia. You're absolutely right. I think it's been less than a dozen across A and B that have been treated, at least that we've heard about anecdotally. And, that's very true for hemophilia. But when you look at the utilization for SMA, for Zolgensma, or if you look at, I'll leave it as for Duchenne, I mean, that's, I think, something that's really important for people to keep in mind about gene therapy is hemophilia gene therapy was essentially an elective gene therapy. But if you have a child born with SMA, or if you have a child with Duchenne, you're absolutely going to get that gene therapy if you can. If that patient's qualified, they're getting it. And we've seen significant utilization of those 2 therapies. And I think too, just, keeping with kind of pre-COVID versus post, when you think about Zolgensma, when it was first approved, it wasn't on the RUSP panel. And so it would be months before these kids would be treated. And now it's on the RUSP panel in all 50 states, and they get treated days
Right
after
away.
they're born.
Really quickly.
Right. And I think that when longer term studies come out, we'll see differences in efficacy as a result. So I think, we can't, that's what's so cool and unique and different and challenging and wild and keeps us all very busy about gene therapy, is that every single one of them is different, and we have to kind of address them individually because they don't have the same sets of challenges.
That's right.
I went down a different road. It may have been, probably didn't answer your question, but I still think it's coming.
Yeah.
I expect that the therapies, we're still going to see these right into the future, and we're going to see more and more of them. I do think, though, that the manufacturers are learning, right? And they may focus in different areas, or, so we may see some different things than we've seen in the past. They've also had an education process here, right? But I don't think they're going
That's
away.
right.
Yeah. And I also think that modalities of delivery and different technologies are going to further amplify the velocity of not just the pipeline, but adoption over time. So looking at one of the newer approved therapies, which leverages tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, TIL therapies, and can treat solid tumors. Most people, when they think about cell and gene therapy, especially in the CAR T space, they hear oncology, right, and hematology, which that's what those therapies initially were treating, were blood cancers. But 80% or so of cancer in the United States, or excuse me, in the world, is actually solid tumor. So as new technologies and even adaptations of things like CAR T come about to treat those types of cancer, now we've got a whole different stratosphere of numbers to play with.
Right.
Because you've got much larger populations. To the extent that these therapeutics come out and maybe are approved higher than a 4th line out of the gate, that's going to have a sizable impact on exposure and utilization.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think precision medicine is here to stay. And this is like the future of medicine, right? And gene therapies have been being studied for over 20 years now. And they just started coming to market like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so that wave is absolutely coming. We need to be ready for that. What type of solutions are needed in the market to protect from cell and gene therapy, the risk exposure, as well as what individuals need in order to get treatment? What do we need in the market? What's missing?
I mean, we provide solutions to the market for cell and gene therapy management. We have a full end-to-end solution for payers and employers to outsource it to us because it as I referenced a few minutes ago, it is that complex. Every one of these therapies is unique, and every one of these therapies has its own set of considerations from a patient throughput perspective, from a centers of excellence perspective, from a right patient, right place, right time, right therapy. And so they do require special handling. They aren't the type of program that you just want to have kind of bundled into your existing care management protocols. And so I think having specialized support for these incredibly complex, expensive therapies that also have the potential for life-changing impacts for these patients is just really critical. And, nobody wants to invest in something, that isn't going to be carefully managed.
Yes.
Which brings me to my last point, and then I bet Brooks will want to comment on this. Also, just the infrastructure for the warranty programs or value-based contracting so that people feel good about it, investing in therapies that don't have long-term data or durability.
Brooks, why don't you tell us what a warranty or value-based contract is before you comment?
Sure. So, value-based contracts or value-based agreements, those have been around for years and years, and typically are mechanisms that are negotiated between a payer and a pharmaceutical manufacturer to guarantee some degree of outcome. And like I said, those have been around for years. The concept of warranties or modified outcomes-based contracts is relatively new to the market. I mean, within the last 5 years or so, the intent of a warranty construct is actually to bring some insurance rigor to those contracts so that it's not purely a contractual liability, but has a little bit more of a guarantee around it with an insurance backbone, if you will. And some of the reasons why value-based agreements have struggled so much in the market is that they are negotiated on a one-off basis and also not typically available to payers of all types and sizes. So, they are very labor intensive to put in place. So pharma itself doesn't, have the capacity to go out and negotiate with every payer in the market. And so typically makes those types of contracts available through either GPO arrangements or with larger regional health plans in general. The influx of some of these other models, be it outcomes-based contracts or even warranties, is that it reduces the burden on the negotiation. So allows for creating kind of a CAM structure with an infrastructure that can support it in terms of monitoring in a much more seamless fashion versus everyone having to stand up their own way to manage a VBA. And I absolutely agree with Ashley that more of those types of mechanisms are going to be necessary as more therapeutics come about. Because we have to also remember these clinical trials are typically run even in the larger disease states with very small patient populations. I mean, we're talking 10, 25, maybe 35 in certain circumstances. And so understanding the true efficacy and durability of those therapeutics, there's just not usually a lot of evidence right out of the gate. And so in absence of the real world evidence collection, which will occur over time with the long-term follow-up protocols, there has to be other mechanisms to help not offset, but protect the investment, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, so we need help for the patient to know where to go to get the treatment. If they get the treatment and it doesn't work, we want a piece of that money back flowing somehow from whoever paid for it, whoever backstopped the cost of it, that money to flow back. That's the purpose of a VBC. What about like insurance products, Kelly? Are the current insurance products that we have today, in terms of self-funded community, the stop-loss product, and in medical reinsurance, are those products enough to cover the risk of gene therapy?
I think we'll see some continued evolution, right? There has been some, but for example, there's a lot of self-funded employers that are really large that don't buy stop loss today that probably should and will want to buy maybe a gene therapy only stop loss cover or something like that. And there's not really a lot of that in the market. I also think there are entities that maybe buy at certain levels today, either on an excess basis, they want to buy lower levels, even different structures of reinsurance, right? Maybe I'm a health plan and I think I'm going to have, 10 claims and I can afford 14, but what if I have more than that? And so some different structures on the reinsurance, I think. And then, the other thing that's a big issue, and it's a challenge for all sides, is known claims and people with known diagnoses, right? And how do we handle that? So,
Yes.
that's a big issue. Impacts us as reinsurers and stop-loss carriers, but it also impacts the clients, right? So if you're a self-funded employer and you have somebody with Duchenne, you can't necessarily afford a $3 million claim, right?
Yes.
So that's a big issue. And we just, it's a tough one to solve, but we have to work together and solve that.
All right, so here's a controversial topic. The government should cover the cost of gene therapy. Is that the right way to think about it? What do you guys think?
Well, I think the government, right now, we've got Medicare and Medicaid, right? And there's a lot of challenges there for the government, right? I mean, it's a huge spend and we're trying to reduce the cost and they're trying to push that risk into the private market. And, there's already a lot going on in the government risk space. So on the one hand, could be a risk pool, right? That could go over everybody. But on the other hand, I think they've got a lot on their plate already from a cost standpoint.
I would agree. And I think, maybe you're thinking kind of along the lines of like ESRD. Could it be something along those lines?
Like a shared expense after some time.
Mean, in theory, but what's going to happen when there's 100 of these on the market or 150? I mean, so first of all, it would take 5 or 10 years for that to actually come to fruition. And then when it does, by then, there could be literally hundreds of these once we get into sort of, the cell therapy space, moving into autoimmune and some of the other kind of therapeutic areas people are looking at. So then we're at a point where such a significant portion of folks are going to have conditions that would end up in this pool that it kind of defeats the purpose, because then what are we insuring? So
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge, is just kind of speed to getting something stood up and then the speed of development of these therapies.
I agree with Ashley. Well, actually, with both Ashley and Kelly. I think that there probably are alternative structures that maybe could be driven to some degree by the government. And I'm going to go way back in time and think about like the Hep C model, if you will, when some of the Hep C therapies came out. Not every state adopted the models that ended up working, but some sort of subscription-based fee that was offered ultimately by manufacturers that could bridge the gap, if you will.
Sure.
I don't think in our current state and even within the next couple of years that type of model is necessarily going to work, but there will be a time, to Ashley's point, with some of these more prevalent disease states that impact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans. We will have to start to think through different solutions, and that's going to require multiple people at the table. What I do not think is that one of the government agencies can sit down and come up with a solution in a box. It's going to require collaboration, and the economics are going to have to work for everybody involved as well. So there's definitely a solution and a potential government intervention at some point, but I think we're years away from that at this point.
Okay. Well, this has been a great discussion so far. I'm going to get you guys out of here with one more question. Most of the audience for this podcast is stop-loss and reinsurance professionals. So give me a prediction of what you think gene therapy means to the stop-loss and reinsurance industry for this year and going into next year. Kelly, why don't we start with you?
Well, I would say we know a lot more. I started out by saying there were a lot of things we didn't know, right? And we had to try to guess, and it made us nervous. We went from trying to limit the risk and not really avoid, but be sure we understood and could size the risk, so to speak, to now we're trying actually to write more of this risk, actually, right? Because we have more information, we have some data, we have some experience. So actually, I think we've come a long way in really a fairly short amount of time. There still, are a lot of things we don't know, still a lot of uncertainty,
Sure.
Still a lot of risks there, right? But I feel like we're in a much better spot today than we were a few years ago.
Okay. Brooks, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with Kelly in terms of the current state. There's a lot more knowledge out there, better underwriting mechanisms, better actuarial modeling overall, and just a slightly higher degree of comfort with the risk as it sits today. One variable that I think is going to impact things as we move forward is that in many cases, especially in the self-insured community, they're not covering these therapeutics within their plan designs. And that's definitely shifted over time, more people covering the therapies. But at some point here in the relatively near future, covering or not covering will not even be a question. You will absolutely have to cover the therapeutics, especially in these life-saving instances. I'm sure we've all seen the increase in news coverage on X, Y, and Z self-insured employer that wasn't covering the therapies, or
Yes.
maybe just made a plan design change within the last couple of months, and then they have twins born with SMA that had to get treated. I mean, beyond just the news coverage, but that type of news coverage is huge and, can be very detrimental to organizations. So what I predict is that we're going to see more and more, especially self-insured employers, covering these therapeutics, doing so in a meaningful way with proper plan design and medical policies. And that's going to actually increase the exposure as well, which then is going to impact stop loss and reinsurance in different ways. So I guess continuing to pay attention to what's being covered by whom and how, and appropriately, to Kelly's point, underwriting it, can't run away from it, but underwriting it and doing so in an appropriate fashion is, I think, going to be a trend that we continue to see increase over the next couple of years.
Great. Ashley, why don't you bring us home?
Yeah. Well, I think just exposure-wise, this year's going to look a lot like last year. I think it's going to be very similar. However, I think in aggregate, it will continue to, push people towards one or the other perspective. So Brooks just referenced folks not covering cell and gene therapies. Even if exposure looks similar this year as it did last year, it's still those lightning strikes that are happening over and over. And the more lightning strikes that happen, the more people hear about it, the more they become concerned. So they're either going to exclude it or they're going to buy stop loss or some sort of a carve out risk product. So I think we're gonna see continued interest in this space. I do expect a lot of different types of alternative funding mechanisms and things like that to continue to kind of come to fruition. Some of the folks that have things in development will be able to launch those this year. But the other thing that I think that people should kind of keep an eye on, and certainly something that we watch regularly, a lot of what happened, we talked about the impact of COVID and how that impacted ramp and the number of cases that were, happening out in the market. Once COVID sort of settled down and normalized and these therapies were approved, now we're seeing a lot of issues from an access perspective with just provider capacity issues.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of different, factors that impact that. But one of them is just sort of the impact on aggregate receivables for facilities, and can they afford to take title of these therapies? And then once they can, do they have room for them? Can they schedule them? These are incredibly complex procedures to administer. And so those types of issues, I can tell you because we work with all of these centers, those are getting resolved. These centers are preparing themselves to be able to administer these therapies. And when that happens, if there's a facility that right now can't see any patients for whatever reason, but they fix that issue, whatever it is, they've got patients queued up. We know that there are organizations all over the place that have patients queued up. So I do expect that we'll see some of that happening, especially as we move through the rest of 25. And then the last thing that I'll mention is there's a huge push right now to get especially CAR T into the community setting. And so when that happens, this big push towards outpatient CAR T, that's going to open up just a huge amount of bandwidth. And so, you might see that CAR T exposure continues to increase and that gene therapy stays steady, but we're hearing of more and more patients being dosed for sickle cell. I think we'll end up seeing double the number as we move forward. So all of that's going to continue to happen, and eventually we are going to hit that hockey stick sort of trajectory. So
Yeah, and I'll just add my 2 cents here. I do think there's going to be some reversion to the mean. I do think that utilization is going to catch up. Again, our community here is mostly stop loss and reinsurance folks. And stop-loss carriers have been struggling for the past 2 years, and there hasn't really been a lot of gene therapy during that time. And so when that wave hits, we've already seen a couple of stop-loss carriers exit the market in the past 6 months. I think we're going to see a reinsurer or two exit this space as well. And then I think terms and conditions on the types of policies are going to have to change in order to meet what the market needs are. Brooks, I see you have one more comment you want to make.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore one other thing that Ashley referenced too. The provider capacity is one thing, but also the manufacturing capacity. Early on, and especially with CAR-Ts, but now even with gene therapies, the manufacturers only have so many slots that they can use within their manufacturing facilities. And we've watched, especially in CAR-T, over time, as the processes matured and the just overall manufacturing facilities got better at bringing these therapeutics to market, that increased availability. And when it increased availability, to Ashley's point, there are patients waiting in some cases. So with each new therapy that comes about, there's, for lack of a better term, a learning curve. It doesn't matter how well you plan for it from a manufacturing perspective. It still takes a little while to get everything ironed out within the process. So a lot of times when these therapeutics launch, we won't see uptake or that very first case for at least 6 months or longer. The one difference there was Sarepta that was, really prepared when they launched with Elevidys. But many of the therapies, especially if they're utilizing a novel technology like CRISPR, for example, or even the TIL therapies that I referenced earlier, it takes some time to really hit the runway. And so as they get more efficient after the therapies are approved, that's going to increase availability and capacity as well. But it won't happen overnight.
It takes time to go from development to pipeline. It takes time to get FDA approved. It takes time from the time of approval to the time of market uptake. And then it takes time for the claims to actually be utilized. And all that said, precision medicine is here to stay. So we're going to end it right there for today. Thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Kelly. And thank you for joining us for another edition of Firm and Final. We'll see you next time.